The rich are allowed to be wrong in ways you cannot afford to be. That is why their advice travels badly. They can say take risks, be patient, think long term, buy when others are afraid, hold through pain, and all of it can sound intelligent. But here is the part that almost never gets spoken. For one person, a bad year is a delay. For another person, a bad month is the end of the plan, the end of savings, the end of options. So the question is not, is the advice smart? The question is, what kind of life was the advice built to survive? Because some advice only looks universal after the structure behind it has been erased. And once that structure disappears, the listener inherits the blame. You were told you lacked discipline. You lacked patience. You lacked vision. But maybe the advice did not fail because you were weak. Maybe it failed because it came from a risk layer that was never yours. People trust rich people's advice for a simple reason. Success looks like evidence. When someone has won, every sentence they say starts to sound proven. Their habits look like loss. Their confidence looks like clarity. Their past decisions look obvious only because we already know how the story ended. So when a wealthy person says, think long term, it does not sound like a preference. It sounds like a rule. When they say, take the risk, it does not sound like a gamble. It sounds like courage. And when they say, stop thinking small, it does not sound like pressure. It sounds like wisdom. This is how wealth becomes mistaken for universal understanding. The person who escaped the maze gets treated as if they understand every maze. But what if they did not only have better judgment? What if they had more exits? What if the advice worked because the floor underneath them was stronger than the one underneath you? The surface of the advice is not ridiculous. That is what makes it powerful. Discipline matters. Patience matters. Long-term thinking matters. Risk can matter. Delayed gratification can matter. None of these ideas are automatically false. The problem begins when these words are removed from the conditions that make them survivable. Patience is easier when waiting does not threaten rent. Risk is easier when losing does not destroy the next 6 months. Long-term thinking is easier when the short term is already protected. And discipline sounds cleaner when the bills do not punish every mistake immediately. This is why the advice spreads so well. It contains enough truth to feel safe. But partial truth can be the most dangerous kind. Because the listener hears a principle. The speaker is standing inside a structure. And the structure rarely gets named. So the advice arrives looking pure, moral, and universal. But it is carrying invisible assumptions about money, time, protection, and recovery. That is the trap. The first crack appears when the same advice enters 2 different lives. Take the risk. In one life, that means moving capital from one opportunity to another. If it fails, there is still housing, healthcare, credit, reputation, and time. In another life, that same sentence means leaving a stable income, delaying bills, using savings that were never large enough, and hoping nothing breaks before the next paycheck. The words are identical. The exposure is not. Be patient. For one person, patience means waiting through a market cycle. For another, patience means watching a balance fall while rent keeps arriving on schedule. Think long term. For one person, the long term is an investment horizon. For another, the long term is a luxury that keeps getting interrupted by the immediate. This is the hidden violence of universal advice. It makes unequal risk sound like equal character. It treats different damage as if it came from the same decision. Quietly, brutally, repeatedly. Financial advice does not enter an empty room. It enters a household. It enters a calendar with due dates. It enters a bank account with limits. It enters debt, family obligations, medical risk, unstable income, rising costs, and the quiet fear of one more surprise. That is why structure matters. Structure is not motivational. It is not glamorous. It is the boring layer that decides what happens when advice goes wrong. How much cash is available? How quickly can income recover? Can the person borrow without panic? Can they wait without losing housing? Can they sell something without destroying the future? Can one mistake remain a mistake? Or does it become a chain reaction? This is the part most advice skips. Because advice sounds better when it is clean. But real life is not clean. A person's financial position is partly measured by whether they can control month-to-month obligations and absorb a shock. Without that capacity, even good advice changes shape. Structure has many names: assets, liquidity, credit access, time, optionality, recoverability, exit routes, non-immediate downside. These words sound technical, but they describe something very human: the difference between being wrong and being trapped. If you have assets, a problem may become a financing decision. If you have liquidity, a crisis may become an inconvenience. If you have credit, time may be borrowed. If you have a network, failure may be softened. If you have recoverability, the first mistake does not have to become the final one. But when those layers are missing, advice becomes heavier. A sentence like "hold on," or "wait it out," or "stay disciplined," can become dangerous when the person has no room left to absorb the delay. The rich are not only hearing different advice. They are often hearing the same advice inside a different protective architecture. That architecture is what turns mistakes into stories instead of scars. This is the missing machinery. This is the difference between the wealth world and the labor world. In the labor world, money often arrives as income and leaves as monthly exposure. Paycheck in, rent out, food out, debt out, transport out, insurance out. 1 month closes, and the next month starts making demands before the person has recovered. In the wealth world, money can also live as a balance sheet. Assets sit. Assets appreciate or decline. Assets can sometimes be borrowed against. Assets can sometimes wait. Some gains are not income until they are realized. Some decisions can be timed. This does not mean wealth is risk-free. It means the risk often moves differently. A paycheck is immediate. A bill is immediate. But capital can sometimes choose its timing. So when advice moves from the balance sheet world into the paycheck world, something breaks. The words survive the journey. The protection does not. And that is why advice that sounds intelligent at the top can become dangerous near the edge. Now imagine an ordinary person trying to follow the advice exactly. They are told to invest consistently, but their emergency fund is thin. They are told to think long-term, but every month demands short-term survival. They are told to take risks, but one failed risk could damage credit, rent, transportation, or family stability. They are told to be patient, but patience has a cost when cash flow is fragile. Nothing about this person is stupid. They may be disciplined. They may be careful. They may be ambitious. They may be doing the math every night at a kitchen table nobody sees. But the advice was not written for the room they are sitting in. It assumed a cushion. It assumed time. It assumed recoverability. It assumed that being wrong would not immediately become punishment. So the person follows the rule and still gets hurt. Then they look back and wonder why something so reasonable damaged them. That is how false safety works. The damage does not stay financial. It becomes psychological. Because once the structure is removed from the story, failure has only one place left to go: your character. You were not patient enough. You were not brave enough. You were too emotional. You were too short-term. You did not believe hard enough. You did not hold long enough. You did not take enough risk. You took too much risk. You waited too long. You acted too soon. The explanation always finds a way back to you. That is what makes this kind of advice so powerful. It does not just tell you what to do. It teaches you how to blame yourself when the advice fails. And because the advice sounded intelligent, you may not question the missing structure. You question your discipline. You question your intelligence. You question your future. But sometimes the failure was not personal. Sometimes the advice was transferred across the wrong risk layer. In silence, repeatedly. This is where advice becomes a morality play. The wealthy story says, "I was disciplined, so I won." The public version says, "If you copy the discipline, you can win too." But the erased version says something colder. The discipline sat on top of assets. The patience sat on top of liquidity. The risk sat on top of recoverability. The long-term vision sat on top of short-term protection. Once those layers are removed, the story becomes cleaner, more inspiring, and more marketable. It also becomes less true. Because now the listener is not being given the full operating system. They are being given the visible behavior without the invisible support. And when it fails, the structure remains protected because the blame moves downward toward the person who tried to follow the rule. This is why the advice does not have to be a lie to be dangerous. It only has to be incomplete in the right direction. And it looks fair. The advice was never universal. It only sounded universal because the structure had been erased from the story. That is the realization. Not that rich people can never teach anything. Not that every successful person is lying. Not that discipline is meaningless. Not that risk is always foolish. The realization is more precise than that. Advice changes meaning when the downside changes. A rule spoken from safety does not become the same rule when heard from exposure. A strategy built around optionality does not become universal because the sentence is simple. And a life with assets, liquidity, credit access, exits, and time cannot be used as the default model for a life that must survive month by month. The words may be the same. Take risks. Be patient. Think long term. Stay disciplined. But underneath those words are different consequences. And once you see the consequences, the advice no longer sounds neutral. It sounds located. Came from somewhere. It has an address. So maybe you were not only given bad advice. Maybe you were given advice from a level of risk that was never yours. You were handed the language of patience without the room to wait. You were handed the language of courage without the protection to be wrong. You were handed the language of long-term thinking while the short-term kept charging interest. And when the advice did not save you, the story taught you to look inward, to blame your habits, your mindset, your discipline, your fear. But the missing piece was not always inside you. It was often outside the sentence. It was the asset base never mentioned, the buffer never named, the exit never shown, the recovery time never counted, the floor under the advice. That is the false safety. Not a scam. Not a slogan. Something quieter? Advice packaged as universal truth, while quietly depending on a structure most listeners were never given. And most people only discover it after the cost has arrived.